Japanese-Canadian internment, 1941 to 1949. This is an example of cultural genocide in Canada. Between August 1941 until March 31st, 1949, the Japanese Canadians that lived in British Columbia experienced a loss of their rights, their property, and their freedom. These events have been termed cultural genocide by Pamela Sugerman. She defines it as the deliberate destruction of a community, a form of cultural genocide, an erosion of human dignity, and a dramatic disruption of personal lives and family relationships. In August 1941, the RCMP started registering and fingerprinting all Japanese Canadians aged 16 and over. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The result was widespread panic and hysteria throughout North America, especially along the Pacific coast. Immediately, the government shut down all the Japanese language newspapers. They confiscated all the Japanese Canadian fishing boats. They imposed curfews and started interrogating any suspicious or subversive individuals. In January 1942, the Canadian government decided to evacuate all Japanese Canadians that lived within 100 miles of the BC coast. Between March and October 1942, 22,000 people were relocated. The men between the ages of 18 and 45 were sent to work camps. Women, children, and the elderly were sent to internment camps in ghost towns in the interior of BC and other provinces. Often these people were given only 24 hours notice. Families were allowed to take 150 pounds of their own personal possessions with them, or each individual could take 70 pounds. So basically what you could carry, that was all you had. The people were taken to the processing area in trucks and on trains. The processing area was Hastings Park in Vancouver. This was basically the site of the British Columbia exhibition. It was the only facility that was large enough to contain that large number of people. The facilities were originally designed for housing livestock, and they weren't cleaned before the evacuees were processed. As a consequence, there was no privacy, and the place was, smelled of urine and manure and good stuff like that. They were relocated between October and March 1942. There's a list of the internment camps. The road camps where the men were sent were used for building the highways in Western Canada, including the Yellowhead Highway. There were some self-supporting camps for the more well-off evacuees. Self-supporting meant that they had to pay for their own transportation to the internment camp, their own housing, their living expenses, and any personal expenses. The advantage, of course, was that they could stay together as a family. 700 or so were actually detained as prisoner of war in Petawawa and Angler. Here's some pictures of some of the internment camps in British Columbia. As an alternative to going to the internment camps, men had an option of going to work in the sugar beet fields in southern Alberta and Manitoba. This is dirty, hard work, weeding acres and acres of plants in basically a desert. As if this weren't enough, all the individuals lost the right to keep to their own property, and the government started selling it off and auctioning it off in 1943. Then, in 1944, the decision was made to expatriate the Japanese Canadians. They were basically given the option to return to Japan, or they could relocate east of the Rocky Mountains. They justified this as sound policy and in the best interest of the Japanese Canadians, so that they would not create feelings of racial hostility. Another case of blaming the victim. In April 1st, 1949, their restrictions were finally lifted. They regained their rights as Canadian citizens. They were able to vote and move freely. They could move back to British Columbia at that point. However, they had no home to go to. The important thing to remember is that these events occurred despite the fact that the RCMP and Canada's senior military officers considered the removal of the Japanese from the coast in the first place totally unnecessary. There was no credible evidence then or now that the Japanese Canadians were a military or security threat to Canada or to BC. On September 22nd, 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney issued a public apology and announced compensation from the Canadian government for the Japanese Canadians. Each survivor from the camps received $21,000. The criminal records were cleared of those who were accused of violating the terms of the War Measures Act. $12 million was dedicated to establishing a Japanese community fund for rebuilding Japanese communities, and $24 million was to establish the Canadian Race Relations Foundation to ensure that this type of discrimination would never occur again in Canada. The total cost in 1986 dollars, according to a Price Waterhouse report, was $443 million. Of this, $333 million was income lost, and $111 million was from property that had been seized. This included all their businesses, their farms, their fishing boats, their houses, and their personal effects. The loss to their culture has been priceless. As a consequence of these events, the Japanese Canadians have been pretty much completely assimilated into the matrix of Canadian society. As Mitch Iwakawa states, they were determined to be 100% Canadian, which meant white, Caucasian, and they raised their children with little exposure to their Japanese culture or their language. As a consequence, they pretty much lost it. Thank you for your time.